Late one night in 1870, a Harvard medical student named James Adams walked down a dark street toward the gate of a cemetery in the quiet town of Malden, Massachusetts. And with him was his classmate William, who was carrying an unlit lantern. Once they reached the gate, they both stopped and looked around to make sure nobody was watching, and then they helped each other climb over the gate. And once they were on the other side, they took off running straight down the cemetery path. And eventually, after running for a minute, they got to the other side of the cemetery and they came to a stop outside of a brick mausoleum that contained the remains of a man named Ephraim Gray, who had died 20 years earlier. So for years, James and William had been hearing all these rumors about this guy, Ephraim. In fact, many of their classmates had heard these rumors, and some people really believed they could be true. But tonight, James and William had snuck in here to this mausoleum to once and for all prove that those rumors were false. According to the rumors, when Ephraim was alive, so 20 years earlier, he'd been this very reclusive chemist who lived in a big house in the middle of town, and he had this one servant. And anytime people walked past his house, apparently they would always smell this really pungent chemical scent. And people believed that what Ephraim was doing in there to produce that smell was basically trying to come up with a potion that would make him immortal. He was basically running these strange experiments. However, clearly his experiments had not worked because Ephraim had died anyway. But when he died, his one servant had told the mortician not to embalm him, which was very unusual at the time. This was not a normal request. The servant had said that, even though Ephraim's elixir had not actually succeeded in keeping him alive forever, it had been successful at making his physical body immortal. The servant said, apparently, Ephraim's body would never decay. And so this story had become sort of a local legend. And decades later, lots of people in the area, in particular in Harvard Medical School, students actually believed it might be true, or they at least pretended it could be true. It was fun to believe. But James, as much as he wanted to, go along with the story, logically he felt like there is simply no way there could be any truth to this story. As a medical student, he knew that even the very best embalming techniques would only preserve a dead body for a few weeks at most. So there was no way Ephraim's body, that had been dead now for 2 decades, was not a pile of bones by now. And tonight, they were going to go find out. James knelt down in front of the mausoleum where Ephraim was entombed. And William struck a match and lit the lantern he had brought with him. And immediately the light from the lantern, it illuminated the door that led into the mausoleum, and they saw it was sealed shut with a padlock. So James, who's knelt down right next to the door, he pulled out a small hammer and a chisel, and he began to work on this lock. And eventually, he popped it open, he took the lock and put it on the ground, and then he stood up, and he and William were like, all right, here we go. And they pushed the door, and it slowly swung open. James stepped inside first, with William right behind him, holding up the lantern. And the space was cold and musty, and it was this kind of claustrophobic, all brick space that was covered in cobwebs. And on each side of the inside of this mausoleum were these big shelves with caskets sitting on each shelf. These were all different relatives of Ephraim's, and there were nameplates attached to each of these caskets. And so very quickly, James and William, they began looking, for the right casket that contained Ephraim. And eventually they found the right one, and they're sort of nervous at this point, but they're like, all right. And they got to either side of this casket, and together they pulled it off the shelf and put it down on the floor. And so James and William, they both went to the same side of the casket. And William, he's holding up his lantern, and they look at each other. They're like, all right, here we go. And James reaches down and he opens up the casket. And when they see what's inside, they can't believe it. Inside of this casket was definitely Ephraim's dead body. But even though Ephraim's clothing had clearly decayed into stringy brown mush, Ephraim himself did not look like he had been dead for 20 years. His skin was white and smooth, and there were no signs of decomposition on his body whatsoever. He was pristine. In fact, he looked like he was just sleeping, like he could just open his eyes and he'd be just fine. And so James and William are so spooked by this that they just instantly slam shut the casket, they turn, and they sprint out of the mausoleum, they flee the cemetery, and they pledge to never talk about this again. However, for the next few months, James just could not get the image of Ephraim's impossibly well-preserved body out of his head. Now, he still didn't believe the rumors that somehow, it's because of some potion that Ephraim drank that's made his body, immortal or something. But he read every chemistry book in the Harvard Library and could not find a scientific explanation for what he had seen. At the same time, James had another stress, which was he knew the Malden police were investigating the break-in at the mausoleum, and he was terrified that at some point, he and William were going to be found out. Desecrating a grave was a crime, and if James was actually arrested for it, he would get kicked out of medical school. But weeks turned into months, turned into years, and no police showed up at his door. So nobody figured out that he or William were involved in this break-in. And also, over this time, over these many years, he never figured out what actually had caused Ephraim's body to be that well preserved. But eventually, they just moved on with their lives. James graduated, he became a doctor, and he really just sort of forgot about the Ephraim thing. He just moved on. Until 30 years later, in 1900. At that point, James was in his 50s, and he was a successful doctor with his own medical practice in Boston. And one day, he was sitting in his office, catching up on some paperwork, when he heard a knock at the door. And so he called for whoever was out there to come in, and when the door opened up, he was very surprised to see a police officer. The officer told James that he was from the Malden Police Department, and he was looking into an unsolved break-in at the cemetery from 30 years earlier. Immediately, James felt sick to his stomach, and he was about to just start lying, saying he had nothing to do with it. But before he could say anything, the officer just said, "Look, multiple people in town have already told us that you and your friend William were responsible for that break-in." At this point, James knew he was caught, and there was no point in lying. Clearly, this officer knows what actually happened. And so James just rushed to explain sort of why they did it. He just said, look, there were these rumors that the body of Ephraim Gray didn't decompose because he apparently drank some, immortality potion, and we thought it was crazy. So we broke in just to look at the body. We just opened the casket, looked at the body, we shut it, we ran out, that was it. But the officer, after hearing this story, just narrowed his eyes and stared at James like he didn't believe him. And then when the officer went on to explain exactly why now, 30 years later, they were taking another look at this break-in, when he explained that, James literally just could not believe what he was hearing. So it would turn out the Malden Cemetery was in the process of being relocated. So workers were going through and moving every single grave. But when they got to Ephraim Gray's casket, they noticed it was unusually light. So they opened it up and found it was empty. There was no sign that anybody except for James and William had ever tampered with that mausoleum. And so basically, James and William were being accused of stealing Ephraim's body. But they both swore they didn't do that. They said they just went in, they looked at the body, were shocked that it had not decomposed, and they ran out. They didn't take the body. But police, during their investigation, saw that nobody else tampered with this casket except for James and William. So where did the body go? It was almost like Ephraim had simply woken up one day, looking as fresh as ever, opened up his coffin, and just walked out. And despite all of James and William's skepticism and all their medical training, they couldn't help but wonder if maybe somehow Ephraim's immortality potion had finally kicked in. Gas, groceries, eating out, even on the tightest of budgets, there's really no escaping nor controlling them. But here's what you definitely can control: getting cash back every single time you fill up, you hit the grocery store, or go out to eat with the Upside app. One thing I really like about Upside is that it doesn't require me to change anything I'm already doing. So before I fill up, I just check the app to see what offers are available nearby. It only takes a few seconds. And getting cash back on gas I was already going to buy is always a nice bonus. Here's how it works. Open the Upside app, claim an offer, pay with your card like normal, and get paid. That's it. And yes, it's cash back, not points you'll never use, not credits that expire. It's real money you transfer straight to your bank account. Upside has given back $1 billion to its users. To find out how much you could earn, download the free Upside app and use promo code Mrballen to get an extra 25 cents back for every gallon on your first tank of gas. That's an extra 25 cents back for every gallon on your first tank of gas using promo code Mrballen. Available to US consumers only. On the afternoon of January 28, 1945, an Australian reporter named Robert Cheney sat on a wooden bench inside of a small, cramped room in a swelteringly hot church in Brazil. He was squeezed shoulder to shoulder with several other reporters and a few doctors who were wearing white coats. All the lights were off in this church, and there was this religious hymn that was playing on a phonograph, which is like an early record player. And on the other side of the room, standing in front of a heavy locked door, were these two people, these two psychic mediums, who were twisting and groaning as if they were in pain. So the reason that Robert and everybody else, the other reporters, the doctors, were gathered here today was because of what was happening inside of that locked room. There was a man in there who was having his appendix removed. Now, usually, appendix removal was a routine surgery, and it would be performed without an audience and in a hospital instead of a back room in a church. But this operation was being performed by a very, very famous surgeon named Dr. Louise Gomes. And Dr. Gomes had only agreed to do the surgery under a couple of very odd conditions. So first, it had to be done in this church. Second, no one else could enter the operating room, so that backed locked room, while he was working. Not even nurses or anesthesiologists, nobody. And third, the only people Dr. Gomes would communicate with during this operation were those two psychic mediums standing outside the door. They wouldn't even be in the room with him, they'd be outside. And so after all these conditions were agreed to, before the surgery, the two mediums worked with the doctor to gather all the supplies and made sure they were in the back room. And then also they strapped the patient down to the operating table in the back room, and then they came out again. And then at that point, the reporter, Robert Cheney, and the other witnesses that were there to see this, the other reporters, the doctors, they helped board up all the windows of this back room of the church. And they also searched for any hidden passageways to make sure nobody could look into or sneak into or out of this back room, the operating room. And so eventually everything was ready, and Dr. Gomes and the patient were the only two people inside of this back operating room. It was all sealed off and locked. And then the instructions had been given to, Robert Cheney and the others to just take your seats in the church and wait. And so that's what Cheney and the others did. They just sat there, sort of listening and watching, and nothing was going on. There's just this hymn playing from the phonograph, and the mediums are doing like weird stuff in front of the door, apparently communicating with the doctor, but the whole thing was just sort of absurd. Honestly, Robert didn't really know what to make of this. But when he had caught wind that there was going to be this totally bizarre procedure done, he had come here not to validate that this was a smart or good way to do a surgery, but rather that this would just make a really wild story that people would be interested to read. But the longer Robert sat there listening and watching this totally bizarre scene unfold, the more he felt like he had sort of bitten off more than he could chew, that this was not really worth the time or energy. This was just really, really weird. However, as he's sitting there, sweating in the heat, just sort of waiting for this thing to be over, whatever it was, he overheard a couple of the doctors who were witnesses to this, along the pew with him, talking about Dr. Gomes. And what Robert heard is that these doctors are like, there is no way Dr. Gomes can perform this surgery. Like, he's not capable of performing this surgery. It's not possible. Not to mention, the doctors are also saying that, generally speaking, attempting to perform an appendectomy by yourself with no anesthesia, no nurses, no techs to help, was also just a terrible idea. Let alone, again, Dr. Gomes can't do this. There's no way. And so Robert, after hearing these doctors talk, he started to feel like, oh man, this whole thing's really unsettling. Like, now it's just creepy. The sound of the hymn and the mediums writhing around, presumably communicating with this famous doctor through the locked door. And it's like, please let this end. This is so awful. And he was just staring over at the mediums and the locked door, and suddenly the mediums just stopped. But Robert just continued to sit there with the other witnesses for over another hour. They've been in there now for like 2+ hours, and it's just this horrible scene. But eventually, this booming voice came out of the back room. The doors weren't open yet. The voice was just coming from inside of that room, and the voice yelled that the operation was now over. Robert, at this point, looked over at those two doctors who had sort of voiced their own concerns, and they kind of exchanged a look like, what are we going to see in there? But they had waited this long, they really wanted to see, so they all stood up and they made their way over to the door. When they got to the door, the two mediums stepped out of the way, and then one of the two doctors that was with Robert, they just reached down and tried the door handle, and they found it was now unlocked. And so the lights are on at this point inside the church. This is the first time they're going to see what's inside of this, magical operating room, and they open the door, and the doctors walk in, and Robert follows right behind them, and they look around, and at first it was just really weird. Like, there was really nothing strange in the room. The patient is right in the middle of the room. He's on an operating table. He has fresh stitches right on his side, suggesting he's just had surgery. And literally next to him on the table is a jar with his appendix sitting inside of it, floating in liquid. The surgery had been a success. The patient was okay. However, there was a catch. The surgeon, the famous surgeon, Dr. Gomes, was nowhere to be seen. He was not back here. And the reason is because Dr. Luis Gomes was dead. He died 19 years earlier. And it was because the surgeon was dead that all these people, Robert, the two doctors, the other reporters, it's why they were brought here, to bear witness to this unbelievable thing. Because the people who organized this knew that if they didn't have witnesses, nobody would ever believe that this had happened. Even though a dozen witnesses, including Robert Cheney, those doctors, the other reporters, were there in the church that day, and they swore that no living doctor ever went in that back room. They didn't go in during, before, after the surgery. Nobody came out, even though they swore, basically, that the patient was effectively alone in that room. Despite that, X-rays would confirm that the patient had had an appendectomy on that day, that his appendix really was removed, and apparently it was removed by a very highly skilled surgeon. And so, this remains the only surgery on record to have been officially performed by a ghost. At 5 a.m. on the morning of December 5th, 1957, a 74-year-old woman named Frances Bowles woke up in her bedroom near San Francisco, California. And before she opened her eyes, Frances just had this feeling, this sense, that somebody else was in the room with her. But she wasn't bothered by this because she knew it had to be her husband, Gene. So Gene was 82 years old, and he'd been really sick for the past couple of years. And recently, he'd begun sleeping in their guest bedroom, so he wouldn't wake Frances up with all his tossing and turning at night. But then in the mornings, he would often come and join her in bed. And so she's assuming that's what's going on. Gene must have joined me in the middle of the night, and he's next to me in bed. However, when Frances did open her eyes, she saw there was someone else in the room, but it was not Gene. So Frances was lying on her side on the edge of the bed, looking outward. And her perspective, from her head, the way she was positioned, is she was sort of looking down towards the ground when she first opened her eyes. And the first thing she saw when she was looking off the side of the bed were these very distinctive shoes standing, with somebody's legs right next to the bed, basically standing facing her. And she sees these old-fashioned polished dress shoes with very thick heels and a piece of gray fabric buttoned over the ankles, like the way men used to wear back in the late 1800s. Like, these are distinctive and old shoes. And it was actually these shoes that immediately gave away that this was not Gene, because Gene did not own a pair of shoes like that. Frances would know. And as her eyes traveled up from these strange shoes, she saw this was clearly a man, and he had skinny legs, and he was wearing black and gray striped pants, and he had a very small body overall, and he was wearing a white vest with a long black coat with coattails. And then as Frances finally reached this man's head, she saw he had these strikingly blue eyes, and he was looking right at her, and he had this almost mocking grin on his face. And Frances has no idea who this person is. There is a stranger in her house. She's thinking he's broken in. What's he gonna do to me? And she just sat up in her bed and she looked at this guy and he leaned forward and he just kind of continued to smile and he said, "I'm here for Jean." Frances just began to scream at the top of her lungs. But this man, this strange little man with blue eyes, just began to laugh, and then to Frances's total disbelief, he vanished. A second later, Frances heard footsteps, and then the bedroom door flew open, and Jean burst in asking what was wrong. And without thinking, Frances blurted out that there had been somebody in her room. But as she told Jean all about this strange little man and his weird outfit with his blue eyes, and how he vanished, she started to realize that what she was saying sounded absurd. And from Jean's expression, she could tell that he did not believe her. He's thinking, you were having a dream, clearly, like there's no way this happened. And so even though to Frances, the experience she had just had felt 100% real, by the time she was done telling the story and sort of going over it with Jean, she was starting to think that, maybe she had like a very lucid, vivid dream. However, just to be safe, Frances and Jean spent a few minutes walking all around the house, making sure nobody else was here, and also looking for, any signs that maybe somebody had broken in, but there were none. However, Jean did find that the front door was unlocked, which definitely was not something he did. He remembered locking the door before bed, and Frances said she never unlocked it, so that was sort of a strange thing. But other than that, the house was in normal order. And so Frances and Jean, they didn't really know what to do. I mean, they did debate calling the police, but they had no evidence that this actually happened, and they both agreed that the story was just too strange for anyone to believe. And so by 7 a.m. that morning, so just a little while after this whole thing happened, Frances felt pretty convinced that there had been no little man in a room with blue eyes, and this really had just been a very lucid, horrible dream. And so the two of them began to go about their normal morning routine when Jean really started to feel sick. I mean, he was already not doing well in the weeks prior, but he really just started to deteriorate really quickly. This is like 15, 20 minutes after this little man has popped up in her nightmare or whatever. Jean starts falling apart, to the point where Frances actually called his doctor and said, "You gotta come here right now. Something's wrong with Jeannie. He's fallen apart here." By 8 a.m., when the doctor showed up, this is now about an hour after, Frances has had whatever experience she had, whether it was a nightmare or real, they don't know. But this is an hour later, the doctor shows up, and by this point, Jean is like wrecked. He's practically on his deathbed. He's falling apart. He gets rushed to the hospital, and all day that day, they're trying to save him. But by the very next morning, he had died. And then as time went on, whenever she would think about that strange experience, the little man in her room, she would just rationalize it and tell herself that that was just her own mind's way of working out her growing anxiety over Jean's mortality. I mean, after all, he had died literally within 24 hours of that vision, and so maybe that was just her mind's way of getting ready for Jean's death. However, despite telling herself the story and feeling pretty good about that being what this whole thing was, what she could never quite figure out was how her subconscious had created such a strange character with such a weirdly specific wardrobe. She knew she had never seen anybody like that before in her whole life. So how did her mind come up with this really vivid character? But she ultimately just pushed this whole thing out of her mind and didn't talk to anybody about this experience. Well, that is until a few months later. Late one night in the spring of 1958, so a few months after Jean's death, Frances and her 46-year-old daughter, whose name was Jane, were driving down a freeway in Northern California, coming home from a road trip they had taken as sort of a celebration of Jean's life. And so as they're driving along, both women are looking out the window, they're not really talking, and the radio wasn't on, and so the only sound was the sound of the tires on the road. It was just very quiet. But then sort of out of nowhere, Jane spoke up and told her mother about something really weird that had happened to her on the morning of Jean's death. And she couldn't stop thinking about it, and it bothered her so much, she just had to tell her mom. According to Jane, she had woken up on that morning, and standing in her room on the other side was this little man with these strange polished shoes, striped pants, black coat with coattails, and these bright blue eyes who was looking right at her and grinning. And when Frances heard this, she couldn't believe it, and she blurted out to her daughter that she had never told anybody except for Jean, but on that morning, she had seen the exact same man in her bedroom. And so for the rest of the ride, the mother and daughter just compare notes, talking about the whole experience, exactly what they remember, exactly what he looked like, how they felt, like what they thought it meant. And then at some point, towards the end of this sort of revelation they're both having, where they're both realizing they've had this shared experience, Frances says something that catches Jane's attention. Frances says, yeah, and then, right before he vanished, he told me he was here for Jean. And then, your dad died 24 hours later. And Jane, when she heard this, she goes quiet and she looks at her mom and she's like, that's not what he said to me. And Frances is like, what do you mean? Like, what did he say to you? And Jane, she's just looking straight ahead. She's driving and she goes, he said, I'm here for Jane. He was here for me. For a moment, the car just went totally quiet. And neither woman knew what to say. But then Frances was like, well, wait a minute. I know the little man said to me, I'm here for Jean. And then 24 hours later, your dad died. Jean died. And so it sort of seemed like they were connected. And you're saying that the same thing happened to you. You've had the exact same experience as me on the same morning, the same time frame that I know he said, I'm here for Jean. And you think he said, I'm here for Jane? But you're still alive, and that was months ago. You must have just misheard him. He must have said, I'm here for Jean, same as me, and you just thought he said Jane. And so pretty quickly, both women agreed that that had to have been what happened. They had the exact same experience, and in both cases, this guy has said he's here for Jean. Has to be what happened. However, Frances would be wrong. Because on December 7th, 1958, exactly a year and 1 day after Jean died, Frances's daughter, Jane, died as well. It would turn out she had not been perfectly healthy as she and her mother believed when she saw this little man in the strange outfit with the blue eyes. She had had cancer that likely had just cropped up but had gone undetected. And now, by the time doctors were realizing she had it, it was too late. It had spread to the point where there was nothing they could do. Following her daughter's death, Frances was so overcome with grief that she poured her energy into basically just telling everyone she could about this little man that she had seen before her husband's death and her daughter had claimed to have seen before she died. It just felt like, we gotta tell people about this, like what happened? And she even ended up writing to a journalist to try to get this story out there, to try to figure out what the heck that was. However, nobody came forward with any sort of meaningful explanation about what this experience was, what it meant, how real it was. No one knew what to make of it. However, after getting the story out there and describing in agonizing detail every little thing that she remembered from this experience, Frances did learn one piece of information that does seem to begin to explain who this little man was. That man's outfit, the old-fashioned dress shoes, the striped pants, the white vest, the black coattails, is actually the uniform of a very specific profession. The little man with the blue eyes was dressed exactly like a 19th century undertaker. Around noon on October 21st, 1988, a man named Valentino sat at a cafe table sipping a coffee on a sidewalk in Buenos Aires, Argentina. So this particular neighborhood was called Caballito, and it was right in the heart of Buenos Aires. It was very densely populated, and there were lots of tall apartment buildings and shops and cafes with tons of pedestrians and tons of traffic. And so as a result, it often felt very loud and chaotic, and today was no different. But Valentino, despite the craziness all around him, he still wanted to try to find a moment of peace as he had his coffee. And so he sort of sat back in his chair and he just looked up at the sky above all the urban noise, and he took this deep, calming breath. And as he did this, he saw a few birds fly by, and he just kind of smiled to himself, watching them fly on. But then he saw something else. Out of the corner of his eye, just across the street, He saw a flash of something brown plummeting towards the ground in front of a tall apartment building. And so Valentino turned his attention to look and see what this thing was. But what he saw didn't make any sense. There was this one old woman on the other side of the street who had stopped on the sidewalk, and she was staring down at what appeared to be like a pile of clothes at her feet. And the brown thing, the thing that caught Valentino's attention, which he couldn't make out what it was just a few feet away from this pile in front of this woman. But then, this old woman across the street, she just began screaming. And that's when Valentino realized that what he thought was like a pile of clothes at her feet was actually like a person, like a heap of a person on the ground. It was another old woman, and she was completely motionless on the ground. And so Valentino, he's shocked by what he's seeing. He's trying to make sense of it, and he's seeing again now, knowing it's a person on the ground and seeing this brown thing over here, and he's thinking, was that flash of brown, like that brown thing falling and striking this woman who's now motionless on the ground? Is that what happened? And as Valentino is sort of coming up with theories about what he's even looking at, it seemed like at the same time, the entire bustling neighborhood all around him also, just for a moment, stopped and just sort of paid attention to whatever madness was happening over there, as they too were trying to piece together what happened. But then, that brief moment of almost relative calm just completely dissipated, and the street once again descended into total chaos. Passerby and locals started shouting and racing over to the woman on the ground to help her, and very quickly this woman and the other woman who was screaming was completely surrounded by this huge crowd. And Valentino, for his part, he felt very shaken by what he was seeing, and just thinking about the fact that he might have seen effectively this woman get destroyed by whatever this brown thing was. He did see that flash of brown, and so he's sort of traumatized, and he's also, he's thinking he doesn't want to contribute to the pandemonium over there by running over to join the massive throng of people trying to figure out what happened. And so instead, he just stayed at his cafe table, with his coffee, and just watched as this crowd continued to build across the road. Finally, Valentino heard sirens, and he knew that meant an ambulance had to be close. But for some reason, even though he knew that was like objectively a good thing, help was on the way, maybe they can save this woman on the ground, he doesn't know. Even though he felt like he should feel relieved now that professionals are going to show up, they're going to clear the crowd, they're going to handle this, he just couldn't calm down. Like he literally couldn't stop. Like his heart was racing, his pulse was racing, his stomach was in knots. He felt terrible. It was like he was completely reliving this trauma that he's just experienced over and over and over again. As soon as the ambulance came into view and parked, the mass of people saw them and right away parted to let the paramedics come through to try to help this woman. And Valentino, from across the road, he was craning his neck to try and see, what was happening. And as he did, he saw this middle-aged woman who he didn't know crossing the street in the direction of this scene over there. And she just looked like she was just curious. And as she's crossing the road, she got destroyed by a city bus. It plowed directly into her, and she immediately disappeared underneath the bus's wheels. And so Valentino, whose heart was already basically beating out of his chest, he was so upset about everything, he shot to his feet like, what is going on here? Screams erupted from all around him, from other people who had seen the same horrible thing. And he could feel his heart just like racing nonstop, and sweat began dripping down his back. He was almost dizzy with shock, and he began to stagger away from his table, looking frantically around, calling out for somebody to actually help him. Like it was like his body couldn't handle what he was seeing. But nobody came because there were so many other things happening, horrible things that demanded immediate attention from other people that no one's paying attention to Valentino having, a panic attack here. Like he's so low on the priority list. And so as he's sort of fumbling around the cafe, trying to get someone to help calm him down, nobody's paying attention to him. And so eventually Valentino kind of spiraled and then fell to the ground, and he found himself once more, on his back on the ground, staring up at the sky, watching birds fly across. What actually happened on that street in 1988 in Buenos Aires was so improbable that it made newspapers all across the world. So the first woman who was hit by the object that fell from the sky, the flash of brown, she died from the impact. And then that woman, the middle-aged woman who crossed the road to see what was going on, who got hit by the bus, she also died. And Valentino, who witnessed this entire thing, was so stunned and so horrified that he actually had a heart attack. And then he died on his way to the hospital. And so basically, these 3 fatalities that all occurred within minutes of each other were all connected, but were basically freak accidents that all had to happen in succession to even occur. And it all started when that brown thing plummeted through the air, the thing that caught Valentino's eye. And it would turn out that brownish object was actually the 4th victim in this tragedy. That object was actually a poodle named Khaki that had chased a ball straight off the balcony of its owner's 13th floor apartment. This is a paid ad by BetterHelp. It's normal to long for a time when, connection felt easy and being close to people didn't take so much effort. And then you take a look at your life now and it just feels different, busier and more complicated. I mean, there are moments I think about sometimes, nothing big, just, sitting with people I cared about, talking about nothing. At the time, those moments themselves didn't feel important. But now, looking back, I think I'd tell that version of myself to cherish those moments as they were occurring because they don't last forever. And so someday, the relationships you have today may be the ones you wish you had held on to a little bit tighter. Therapy may be able to help you work through life's changes and provide the tools to navigate what's next, even if it looks different than it used to. BetterHelp makes starting therapy easier. Take the quiz and get matched with a credentialed therapist quickly. Switch anytime at no extra cost if it's not the right fit. BetterHelp has served over 6 million people globally. Click the link in the description or go to betterhelp.com/Mrballen and get 10% off your first month of therapy. At 3 a.m. on Sunday, December 24th, 1967, 26-year-old Sammy Brown Jr. sped in his car down a road called Seal Road in Phoenix City, Alabama, with a police siren blaring right behind him. So Sammy was in trouble. It was Christmas Eve, and he had celebrated a little too hard and drank way too much, and he thought he'd be okay to drive home since he lived close by, but he'd been wrong, and he'd ultimately attracted the attention of a police officer who was now chasing him. And Sammy knew he could not get caught, because in addition to being very drunk, he also didn't even have a license to drive in the first place. And so that's why right now he was driving at 100 miles an hour to get away from this cop. But not only was the cop actually gaining on him, but also Sammy could see on the road up ahead that he had another problem, because there was another car in front of him driving in the same direction, and because this other car was actually going the speed limit, Sammy was going to smash into them if he didn't swerve around them. But this was not a highway where Sammy could just easily change lanes. It was a local 2-lane road. So Sammy knew that if he wanted to swerve around this car, he would have to swerve into the oncoming traffic lane. But since Sammy kind of looked and didn't see any other cars in that lane, he just decided to go for it and pray that he got lucky. So Sammy cut his wheel and tried to swerve around this slower car. But again, Sammy is extremely drunk. He's being chased by this cop who's gaining on him, so his anxiety is spiking. He's going so fast, and in this state of mind, Sammy actually misjudged the timing of his swerve, and he clipped the back of the slower car. And as soon as he did, there was this crunch of metal, and both cars began to spin out across the road before they sort of miraculously just came to a stop. Inside of his own car, Sammy sort of sat up and looked around and realized he was unhurt. And then when he looked out the window, he could see the driver of the other car, a man in his 60s, slowly get out and walk to his bumper to inspect the damage. And when Sammy saw this, he realized that despite how bad of a situation he was in, he actually had gotten very lucky. I mean, not only was he alive, but the man he had just hit going nearly 100 miles an hour also appeared to not just be alive, but basically seemed okay. Following the crash, Sammy expected to have some pretty harsh consequences, and he was charged for reckless driving and also driving without a license. But, sort of amazingly, his lucky streak actually would continue, because despite the charges, he didn't actually have to serve any jail time. He just had to pay a couple of fines, which meant Sammy really did not learn his lesson. And so, over a year later, on April 13th, 1969, Sammy once again spent all of his Saturday night drinking, and then at about 1:30 a.m. on Sunday morning, he got into that same car, which he still did not have a license to drive, and then he once again sped down Seal Road, the same road he got arrested on last December. And, wouldn't you know it, just like the last time, he saw a car ahead of him in his lane going too slow, and he decided to go around it. This time, however, he was not being chased by police, so he was not nearly as frantic or anxious. So he began shifting lanes much further away from this slower car. And when he moved into the opposing traffic lane, because of the distance he had given himself, he didn't clip the car in front of him. And for a split second, he felt an intense rush of satisfaction, because this was just more proof to Sammy that he was just an incredibly lucky guy. However, before Sammy could drive his car back into the correct lane, he went around a curve in the road and was immediately blinded by a searing bright light. Then there was a deafening bang, and Sammy's car jerked to the side, and all he saw was a violent swirl of motion as his car again spun around and then finally came to a stop. For a few moments, Sammy just sat there, feeling completely stunned. I mean, again, he's gotten into a high-speed wreck, and he's sort of taking stock of, did he even survive? But after a few moments, he realized he definitely had lived. His neck ached quite a bit from being shaken so hard, but other than that, he kind of looked around and he realized once again he was basically unhurt, so he had just gotten really lucky again. And so eventually he climbed out of his car, and even though he was sort of dizzy from the crash, from the alcohol, when he took stock of what was in front of him, he could immediately see what had just happened. In his effort to avoid hitting the car that was driving in the same lane as him, he had swerved into oncoming traffic and hit a different car, another car, head on, that was driving in the opposite direction. This was like a worst-case scenario. And both his car and the one he had hit were completely destroyed, with the fronts completely smashed in. It was truly a miracle Sammy had walked out of that car. And so Sammy, he staggered over to look at the other car and see if the other driver and, potential passengers were okay. When he staggered over there, when he looked inside of the wreckage, he could not believe what he saw. Because what he saw inside was yet another miraculous stroke of luck. Only this time, it was not the good kind. Sammy had somehow managed to do something that really should have been impossible. He had almost perfectly recreated the accident that he had had a year earlier. He was driving the same car, going down the same road on the same day of the week, and he had crashed for basically the exact same reasons. And then when Sammy looked inside of the car he hit head on, he realized there was one more truly just incredible coincidence. The driver of this car was the same driver as the car he hit a year earlier. The man's name was Francis Patterson. He was 65 years old, and he didn't even live in Phoenix City where this crash happened. It was just a wild coincidence that 2 times, more than a year apart, Sammy had hit him while driving drunk on Seal Road. The only difference this second time around was Francis died from the crash. Following this tragedy, Sammy Brown Jr. was charged with driving while intoxicated and also involuntary manslaughter. He was sentenced to 12 months in prison. On a Sunday night in early 1805, a 13-year-old boy named Emile Deschamps sat at a table full of adults in a house in Orléans, France. Now, Emile was supposed to be having dinner with all the other boys at his boarding school across the city, but his aunt had picked him up as a surprise for a home-cooked meal. And he knew why. His aunt was worried about him. So Emile's parents had sent him to this boarding school in Orléans a few years ago, but he hated the city, and basically right after he got there, His mother had died, and so Emile had really had a difficult time adjusting, and he felt lonely and isolated, and his aunt was definitely aware of that. And so tonight, Emile was very grateful that his aunt, because, she kind of felt bad for him, had brought him here to include him in this dinner, like he appreciated that. But this particular dinner was just full of adults that he didn't know, and it was just incredibly boring. In fact, right now, one of his aunt's middle-aged friends, this guy whose name was Monsieur Foncierbieu, was just rambling on and on about his experience in the military, and, Emile was just not remotely interested. I mean, this was not exciting to him in the least, and so he did what he always did. He just sort of tuned this guy out and let his mind wander. Because Emile had like this really big imagination, and he would routinely, especially when he was, lonely and sad at school, he would just kind of disappear into his own thoughts. But quickly, after he sort of began letting his mind wander, he was pulled right back to reality when his aunt set the dessert down right in the middle of the table. So this dessert was a brown, sauce-drenched cake-like thing that was actually wrapped in a cloth and was piping hot, literally steam coming off of it. And Emile, he just kind of stared at it because he had never seen a dessert like this before and had no idea what it was. And so as he was staring at it, he heard a voice at the table say, "Oh, it was plum pudding, and Emile, you should try this." Emile looked over at the voice who had said this, and it belonged to Monsieur de Fontainebleau, who was smiling at him. This is the guy who had been rambling about his military experience. And the Monsieur repeated that Emile really needed to try a slice of this plum pudding, because it was an amazing traditional English dessert, and it was just absolutely delicious. So Emile let his aunt cut him a slice, and then he took a bite. And he was glad he did, because it really was incredible. It was this rich and sweet and just perfectly warm dessert. I mean, this was like one of the best desserts he had ever had. And so after trying this plum pudding and, telling the monsieur how great it was and thanking his aunt, he just kind of went back to letting his mind wander, and the conversation at the table picked back up again, and, it was just boring adult talk, and the night just kind of continued as is. And then at some point in the night, when the meal and the dessert and everything had all been eaten up, the guests parted ways, and Emile went back to his boarding school. And quickly, when he got back to his boarding school, he forgot about the dinner and the pudding and the monsieur, and just carried on with his life. One afternoon, 10 years later, in the spring of 1815, Emile was 23 years old, and he was living in Paris, about 80 miles away from Orléans. So Emile had basically fled Orléans as soon as he was old enough to strike out on his own. And once he had turned his big imagination into a blossoming career. He was now a poet and a playwright, and he was writing about these big, sweeping human experiences like love and chaos and how mysterious life can be. So Emile that day had basically been writing nonstop and had sort of lost track of time and sort of forgot to eat. And then suddenly he felt super hungry, and so now here he was out and about looking for something to eat. But he was so hungry that he decided he didn't even care where he went. I mean, normally he was picky about where he would eat lunch and dinner, but today he just wanted food. He didn't care where it was. And so he just randomly chose a cafe and went inside. It was a small space with a few customers sitting at some tables, and Emile just walked in and took a seat at an empty one. And quickly thereafter, a waitress came over and handed Emile a menu, and when he flipped it open, he was immediately drawn to the dessert section. He saw this cafe served plum pudding, the amazing English dessert that he had had a decade earlier at that dinner party with his aunt and the monsieur. He had not had plum pudding from that day to now. It had been 10 years. He had just not had it, but he saw it on the menu, and he's like, oh my goodness, I gotta have plum pudding again. That was so good 10 years ago. I gotta have that experience again. And so Emile asked this waitress if he can have a slice of their plum pudding. And she just shook her head and said, I'm sorry, but the last piece we had, I actually just served it to the guy over there. Like, we don't have any more. And the waitress, she saw Emile react to this, and he was like so distraught. He's like, oh man, really? Like, there's no more? Are you serious? And the waitress could sense like he really, really wanted this plum pudding. And so she goes, well, hold on a minute. And she turns and she calls out to the gentleman that she had actually just given the last piece to, who was sitting in the corner of the cafe. And she calls to him and says, hey, would you mind sharing that last piece with this new guest here, with Emile? Because he wants a piece of this plum pudding. And so Emile, he kind of looks around the waitress in the direction of the person that she's speaking to, the guy with the actual plum pudding. And the guy who's sitting over there, he looks up, and wouldn't you know it, it's Monsieur de Fontainebleau, the same guy who was at the dinner party 10 years earlier, who encouraged Emile to eat plum pudding for the first time and only time in his whole life at that point. It's the same guy. Like, they're not even in Orléans, France. They're 80 miles away in Paris. And Emile, he's chosen a random cafe. He'd never been here before, and he just happened to see plum pudding on the menu. Like, what are the odds that it's the same guy and they're having plum pudding? Like, the coincidence here is just unbelievable. And so Emile, he sort of says to the waitress, hold on a minute, I know him. And so Emile, he gets up and walks over to the monsieur, and he sits down next to him, and they're both like, this is crazy, it's been 10 years, and here we are, eating plum pudding together again. Like, what are the odds? And so for the next 15 minutes or so, the two men just caught up about their respective lives. They ate this plum pudding. And then at the end of it, they were like, all right, like, great, nice to see ya. And they both just went their separate ways, with the monsieur going back to whatever he does and Emile going back to his writing. 38 years later, at 6 p.m. on a winter evening in 1853, Emile sat at a tea party in Paris, having a great time as he chatted with the other guests at his table. He'd been invited to this party by the hostess, who was a big admirer of his work. And there were actually a lot of people like that these days. Emile was now in his 60s, and he was very well known. He'd published tons of plays and poems and translations, and he was close friends with many of the literary giants of France and Europe. Like, he had made it as a creative. And so as Emile is sitting at this table, basically being lauded for, all of his achievements and what an incredible writer he was, as he's just sitting there basking in the glory, one of the hostess's staff came in with a platter of dessert. And Emile, he looked over and he saw what the dessert was, and right away he knew he had to have some. It was plum pudding. And so as the staff person came over with the plum pudding to give to Emile, he sort of laughed and told, the staff person and the people at his table the story of how, over the course of his life, he'd only had plum pudding 2 times, when he was 13 and when he was 23. And in both of those situations, when he had had plum pudding, this guy, Monsieur de Fontainebleau, had been present. This man that he didn't know and had only interacted with when he was eating plum pudding. And it was kind of like this crazy coincidence. He described seeing him 10 years later in Paris. He couldn't believe it. That was 38 years ago, but still, it's like this wild coincidence, the biggest one of his whole life. And so he sort of jokingly told the people at the table and the staff, like, hey, here I am about to eat for the 3rd time plum pudding. We better be on the lookout for the monsieur. He's bound to show up. And everyone kind of laughed. They're like, yeah, that's crazy. And so Emile, he gets his plate of plum pudding, he gets his fork, and he scoops a bite, and he's about to eat it when the butler walks into the room and announces that there is going to be one more guest joining them at this tea party. And who walks in, this additional guest? None other than Monsieur de Fontainebleau. And so Emile, he's about to bite the plum pudding, and he looks up and he sees him and he can't believe it. I mean, the guy is like 1,000 years old and he hasn't seen him for 38 years. And the only other times are when he's eating plum pudding. And wouldn't you know it, for the 3rd time here, it's happening again. Like, this is unbelievable. It was crazy the 2nd time. This is now impossible. How is it that he's here as I'm about to eat for the 3rd time this plum pudding? It doesn't make sense. And so Emile just stared at the monsieur with this look of just absolute shock on his face. And the monsieur, as he walked in, he sort of stopped and scanned the room, and he eventually met eyes with Emile. And he had this look of just total confusion on his face. He's looking at Emile, he's seeing the plum pudding that he's eating, kind of, scoping out the whole room. And then the monsieur, he just turned around and he walked away. It would turn out Monsieur de Fontainebleau had been invited to another party on the same floor and had mistakenly wandered into Emile's party at the exact moment he was being served plum pudding for the 3rd time in his entire life. This was truly just an astounding set of coincidences over, a 50-year period. Like, the odds of this all happening exactly as it did those 3 different times he had plum pudding and there was the monsieur, for things to line up that way, it was just staggering to imagine how perfectly each coincidence had to line up. It was almost so much that Emile felt like, there's got to be something else going on here. This can't just be a coincidence. It was just like too much. And so, in fact, Emile would go on to recount his plum pudding and the monsieur story many, many times to his friends in literary circles, and he would ultimately write about it in his eventual memoir. Today, it's been around 200 years since the plum pudding events took place. And during that time, Emile's account has been dissected countless times by probability experts and scientists and mathematicians from all around the world. And nobody has a good answer for how this could have happened. And so in the end, Emile's account about what happened to him actually ended up becoming the foundation for a very famous philosophical concept pioneered by Carl Jung called synchronicity. Synchronicity basically means that some coincidences might not actually be coincidences. They might not be random at all, but instead are actually connected to a much larger meaning or purpose, even if we don't know what that is. On the afternoon of Friday, February 7th, 2003, a 52-year-old woman named Monique Lejeune cleared the table after lunch at her house in Cologne, France. Her husband, Claude, and 2 of her adult sons, Franck and Pascal, were at the table. And while Monique cleaned up, the men talked over what they needed to pack for the overnight trip they were about to take. They were heading to a family gathering near Paris, about 3.5 hours away, to celebrate Claude's sister-in-law's retirement. Monique was not going to go, and she had told her family it was because somebody had to stay home with their 4 dogs. And that was true, but there also was another real reason why Monique did not want to be there. And it was because she just didn't get along very well with Claude's family. So Monique and Claude had gotten married almost 20 years earlier, but at the time they both already had multiple kids from previous marriages. Monique had 3 boys, and Claude had 5 girls. And for a while, the 2 halves of the blended family had gotten along quite well. But over time, there were some personality clashes between Monique and her 5 stepdaughters. When Monique and Claude got married, all 5 girls were at least teenagers, if not in their 20s. And so while they sort of accepted Monique as being part of their lives, they just couldn't view her as an actual motherly figure. They were already close with their actual mother, Claude's ex-wife Beatrice, and so that was their mother, and Monique was like the add-on. Then, in 1993, one of Claude's grandsons, so one of his daughter's children, had accused Monique's eldest son, Jean-Luc, of sexually abusing him, and that had completely ripped the family apart. Now, this was never reported to the police, so there was no actual investigation into whether this really happened or not. But Claude's 5 daughters and Claude's ex-wife Beatrice had fully believed the grandson. And Monique had defended her son, Jean-Luc, and Claude was kind of stuck in the middle of it. And it had gotten so ugly that the 2 sides of the family had just stopped talking to each other for a whole year. And so now the whole family was basically back on speaking terms as they were getting ready for this retirement party, but it was still extremely uncomfortable and tense. And so that is why Monique was not going to go, and also why her son, Jean-Luc, was not going to go as well. Finally, around 3 p.m., as Claude and the 2 sons wheeled their suitcases out to the car, Monique went to the front door and she said goodbye to them and then watched as they hopped in the car and drove off. A few hours later, around 6:30 p.m., Monique heard a knock on the front door. And when she opened it, it was her son, Jean-Luc, and he was standing there holding up his bicycle. He told his mom he was just stopping by on his way home from work. And she said, "Great, come on in." And so Jean-Luc left his bike outside and he walked in, and as he was taking off his coat, he mentioned to his mother that her neighbor across the street, whose name was Henri, had clearly been watching Jean-Luc when he rolled up, like he was basically spying on him. And Monique actually kind of was spooked by that, because Henri was a bit of a loose cannon. For example, anytime anybody parked their car in front of Henri's house, he would shamelessly vandalize their vehicle by slashing their tires or pouring oil all over their car. I mean, the guy just didn't care. In fact, over the years, there had been several heated arguments between Monique and her sons and Henri about parking, and in fact, one of those arguments had even escalated into a physical fight. But since Jean-Luc had shown up tonight without a car, he rode his bike here, Monique just hoped that, whatever issues Henri had, that it wouldn't go anywhere, because there's no car in front of his property, like, we didn't do anything, leave us alone. Monique led her son into the kitchen, where she poured 2 glasses of sparkling wine, and then the two just sat there and chatted for about half an hour, and then Monique gave her son a haircut, and then around 7:05, Jean-Luc said goodbye to his mom. He went outside, hopped on his bike, which had not had its tires slashed by Henri, and he left to go to his apartment with his wife to have dinner. After Jean-Luc was gone, Monique just sort of went about her evening. She corralled the dogs behind a baby gate at the base of the stairs and then fed them, and then she went into the kitchen and began cooking dinner for herself. But then, a little while later, at around 7:30 p.m., Monique heard another knock on the door. And she knew it very likely was not her son, and so as she walked down the hallway to answer it, she just hoped it wasn't Henri. The following morning, the woman who lived next door to Monique woke up feeling pretty tired. She hadn't slept well because someone's dogs in the neighborhood had been barking all night. She got out of bed and walked over to the window and opened up the blinds, and as her eyes adjusted to the light that was flooding in, she looked down from her second-floor window into the yard of the 2-story white house that was next door, Monique's house. And the neighbor saw there was something dark in the middle of the walkway that led to the front door of Monique's house. And so the neighbor, she put her face right up to the window and she squinted to get a better look. And she realized what she was seeing was a body lying face down on the pavement. And so in a panic, this woman ran out of her room, grabbed the phone, and called the police. A couple hours later, Judiciary Police Captain Anne Preem pulled up in front of a white 2-story house with crime scene tape and a medical examiner's van right out front. As Preem got out of her car, a police officer walked over to her and led her to where the body of a woman was lying out in the front yard. The officer told Preem that the victim, Monique Lejeune, had been discovered exactly like this by her neighbors earlier that morning. And based on the progression of rigor mortis, the medical examiner estimated that Monique had likely died between 8 p.m. and midnight the night before. Preem bent down to get a better look at the body, but even before getting up close, she knew this woman had sustained just gruesome injuries. There was blood all over Monique's face and her clothes, and her torso appeared completely ripped apart by what appeared to be stab wounds. Preem guessed, just from looking at the scene, that this woman must have been murdered and likely was stabbed, just at first glance, at least a dozen times. Preem also noticed pretty obvious defense wounds all over Monique's hands and forearms, which certainly suggested again that she was murdered and that Monique had put up a pretty good fight against her killer. And so after a few more moments of just kind of looking over the body, Preem stood back up and asked the officer if the neighbors had seen or heard anything unusual the night before. And the officer said no, aside from the fact that Monique's dogs, she had 4 dogs, had been barking nonstop really the whole night, starting at around 8 p.m. Preem nodded and thanked the officer, and then she made her way over to the front door of the house to look to see if there was any signs of forced entry as the door was closed. When she got there, she didn't see any signs, but she did see a bloody handprint on the outside wall near the door. And then when Preem turned the handle of the door and opened it up, she saw this hallway inside that was absolutely covered in blood. And so Preem very carefully stepped inside, trying to avoid stepping in the blood or tracking any prints anywhere. And she began walking down the hallway very carefully and looking in other rooms. And she saw that for the most part, the blood spatter was pretty well contained in the entryway, which told her that the attack on Monique likely began and ended in the entryway. And so her running theory was, okay, Monique must have had someone come to the door, they knocked or whatever, and then Monique opened the door and was attacked immediately. But then, as Preem stepped back outside, she looked down at the front walkway and noticed something kind of unusual. Despite all the blood right inside the front door, there was no blood at all on the walkway between the door and the spot where Monique's body was found. And just from the amount of blood that the victim had clearly lost inside the house, Preem doubted that she would have been capable of running out into the yard after the attack. So she had to wonder if maybe the body had been moved post-mortem. And Monique was a large woman. So if her killer had been able to overpower her, one, and then also move her body such a far distance after she was dead, Preem assumed that whoever her killer was likely pretty strong. In fact, Preem just kind of assumed that the killer had to be a big, strong man. However, what Preem didn't understand was why would the killer want to drag a corpse out into the yard where the neighbors could see them? Unless, for some reason, they wanted Monique to be found as soon as possible. And since at least at this point, it appeared like Monique likely had gone to the front door and opened the door for her killer, Preem thought that the killer must be someone that she knew. Around noon on that same day, so February 8th, 2003, Police Captain Anne Preem was about to go next door and speak to one of Monique's neighbors herself when suddenly a car pulled up at the curb and 3 men climbed out looking completely shocked and very concerned. By this point, Preem had learned from the neighbors that Monique had a husband and also adult sons, and so Preem assumed that these men must be them. So right away, Preem hurried down the walkway to cut the men off, to keep them from entering the crime scene. And the 3 men, they just began crowding around her, asking her, like, what's going on? Where's Monique? What's happened? And she told them that, unfortunately, Monique had been stabbed to death. And at first, all 3 of them just went completely silent. And then one of them, one of the sons, just began to cry. Preem then told them that they couldn't go into the house because it was still an active crime scene. So instead, she led them over to the curb and they all sat down. Preem could tell the men were in shock because as much as one man was crying, it just seemed like they couldn't even process what they were told. But it was important to find out what Monique's family knew as soon as possible. So Preem pulled out a notepad and gently asked them about the last time they had seen Monique. The husband, Claude, said that they had all left the house around 3 p.m. the previous afternoon, leaving Monique at home alone. They said they had gone to a family gathering near Paris that evening and stayed overnight, and they'd only now just gotten back into town and they'd seen this whole scene out front, the police tape and police, they had no idea what was going on. Eventually, Preem asked Claude to tell him all the names of all the people in their family, all their adult children, Claude's ex-wife, Monique's ex-husband, everybody. But as Claude was giving this information, he told her that he just couldn't imagine anybody in the family being involved in this. Preem nodded, but she knew that it was entirely possible that family was involved. I mean, unfortunately, this stuff does happen. But she didn't give that off. Instead, she just said, well, can you think of anyone who would want to hurt Monique? And Claude thought about it and just said no. She lived a pretty normal and uneventful life. But then one of the sons piped up and mentioned that actually there might be someone. He said her neighbor, Henri, and he pointed across the street at the house. A minute later, Preem was knocking on the front door of Henri's house. And after a few seconds, a middle-aged man answered the door. And he was very curious about what was going on across the street. And eventually, Preem told him that, well, your neighbor Monique has been murdered. And when she said that, Henri smiled. So immediately, alarm bells are going off in Preem's head. She's thinking this guy is very suspicious. And she asked him, like, can I come in and look around then? And Henri didn't even seem surprised by this request. It was like he already knew he was going to be looked at as a suspect and said, sure, come on in. So he stepped aside and Preem came in and began searching every room in the house, the living room, the kitchen, the upstairs bedrooms. But despite looking everywhere, she didn't find any traces of blood or really anything else suspicious or unusual. So eventually, Preem made her way back into the living room where Henri was waiting, and she asked him, where were you the previous evening? And he told her very casually that, well, he and his wife were home. They were here. Preem thought this was a pretty weak alibi, but she made a mental note to follow up with the wife and confirm it later. Next, Preem asked Henri if he had seen or heard anything out of the ordinary the night before. And Henri said no, except that maybe around 7 p.m., he had seen one of Monique's sons leaving her house on his bicycle. And at this, Preem perked up because the family had told her that Monique had a third adult son named Jean-Luc, who had not gone to that party in Paris. And if Henri was telling the truth, it meant that Jean-Luc was very likely the last person to see Monique alive. And maybe he was even the killer. The next morning, Prem led a forensics team up the stairs of a rundown apartment building in a sketchy part of town. She knocked on the door to Jean-Luc's apartment, and a moment later, a young man answered. After confirming that he was Jean-Luc, 2 officers led him away to be questioned back at the station. Meanwhile, Prem went in with the forensics team to search his apartment. And pretty quickly, as Prem was walking around the living room, one of the other officers called her over to look at something. And so she walked over to him, and she saw he had his flashlight out and he was pointing it at something on the wall. And when she got close enough, she could see that what he was highlighting were what appeared to be tiny drops of blood. And so Prem pulled out her flashlight, and she too began scouring the walls and the floor near the stairs, looking for any more blood. And she found a few more red droplets near the doorknob to a closet. And so she opened the closet up, and inside was a bike. And she shined her flashlight on the bike, on the wheels and the frame, and she saw all these reddish-brown splatters all over the underside of it, as if whoever had ridden this bike last had basically drove through a puddle of blood. An hour later, Prem walked into an interrogation room at the police station where Jean-Luc was sitting with his head in his hands. He looked up as she entered, and he had this very scared and confused expression on his face. Prem sat down across from him and right away asked him what he had been doing at his mother's house on the night of February 7th. Jean-Luc said he had just stopped by after work, as he often did, and he only stayed for maybe half an hour before riding his bike back home. When Prem asked him if he had gone straight home afterwards, Jean-Luc said no, he hadn't. He explained that his wife's brother, Christophe Gressier, lived in the same apartment building as they did on the floor right below them. So before going up to his own unit, he said he just stopped by to chat with Christophe for a few minutes, and then after that, he spent the rest of the night in his own apartment with his wife. However, to Prem, she felt like there had to be more to this story, because they had found what appeared to be droplets of blood sort of scattered throughout Jean-Luc's apartment, and then, there was blood, or at least what appeared to be blood, on the underside of his bike. And so she figured, maybe if she pushed hard enough, she might be able to get him to change his story. So she told him point blank they had found blood in his living room, and they were now sending it to the lab for analysis. And when Jean-Luc heard this, his face went bright red, and he began stammering that the blood was very likely from a neighbor who had injured himself while visiting a few days earlier. Prem nodded, but then told him, they'd also found blood sort of all over his bike. And Jean-Luc, he sort of hesitated and stuttered and stammered, but really couldn't come up with any way to explain that. At this point, Prem felt like she had Jean-Luc right where she wanted him. So she just told him to be quiet for a second and just roll up your sleeves so she could look at his arms. Prem knew, based on the defensive wounds on Monique's body, that she likely had fought back really hard, and she must have left at least a few scrapes or bruises on her killer. However, when Jean-Luc finally, rolled up his sleeves, Prem didn't see a single scratch or bruise on his hands or arms. A few minutes later, Prem left the interrogation room and walked to her office. Despite the lack of defensive wounds, Jean-Luc was definitely still acting suspicious, and she was not ready to let him go. But she also didn't want to get tunnel vision and completely ignore any other suspects, in case the blood inside of Jean-Luc's apartment did turn out to just be a big coincidence. So she sat down at her desk, and she opened up a file, and she began flipping through the notes of interviews that her team had already done with the rest of Monique's family and her neighbors. Monique's sons had mentioned in their interviews that there was definitely some tension between Monique and her 5 stepdaughters. But officers had spoken to all the stepdaughters as well as their husbands, and even though some of the women had admitted they still had an issue with Monique, they all had alibis, both the women and their husbands, for the night that Monique was killed. Also, several other family members had mentioned that Claude's ex-wife, Beatrice, definitely did not get along with Monique. But officers had tracked down Beatrice, and she just didn't seem like a very strong suspect. Beatrice had said, for the most part, she and Monique, even if they didn't get along, they just stayed out of each other's way, and that they hadn't seen each other in over a month. And also, Beatrice was remarkably tiny and frail. She was barely 4 foot 9 inches tall and 58 years old and just seemed really weak. So it just seemed almost impossible that she could have overpowered the much larger Monique and inflicted the injuries that were inflicted on her and then dragged her out to the front yard. It just seemed sort of impossible. And so, even though she wasn't totally ruled out, for the most part she was. Just then, there was a knock on Prim's door, and when she looked up, she saw there was another officer standing there, and he told her there were 2 people here who wanted to speak to her. Prim nodded, and then a moment later, a very nervous-looking middle-aged man and woman came into the office. They sat down across the desk from Prim, and the man said they had information that could help with the Monique Lejeune investigation. Prim sat up and grabbed a notepad and said, "Okay, tell me what you got." And she began writing as the man explained that he was a co-worker of Christophe Gressier. And Prim immediately recognized that that was the name of Jean-Luc's brother-in-law, the one Jean-Luc said he had visited on the night Monique was killed. That was the person he saw apparently right after he left Monique's house. The man sitting across from Prim said that just a few hours ago, he'd gotten a call from Christophe's number. But when he answered it, all he could hear was a sort of muffled conversation between 2 women. And at first, this man thought what he was hearing was just an accidental call, maybe by Christophe's kid who was just pressing buttons at random. However, the man said when he put his phone on speaker, he and his wife, who was the woman he was with, they both started listening really closely, and they were able to make out a snippet of the conversation. The 2 women on the line were clearly talking about needing an alibi and saying something about a man named Jean-Luc. First, the women had said something like, "It's not Jean-Luc's fault, he's depressed." And then the women had mentioned something about a pair of pants that needed to be washed. Prim couldn't believe what she was hearing. Any doubts that she had had about Jean-Luc being the killer pretty much disappeared. And so she took down the couple's names and contact info, showed them out of her office, and then once they were gone, she grabbed her keys and she headed out to go to Christophe's apartment. Now, by this point, Christophe had already been taken into custody and questioned, and he had completely denied knowing anything about Monique's murder or the phone call that was apparently made from his number. But Prim hoped that maybe a search of his apartment would tell a different story. She walked through each room of the apartment until she found the washing machine. And there, she put on a pair of latex gloves, and she reached inside the washing machine, and she pulled out a pair of pants that were still damp, as if they had just been washed earlier that day. And she held these pants up and kind of put them in the light, and she could see clearly there was a brownish stain on them. She also noticed that these pants looked like they'd be way too small for Christophe, who was a pretty tall and burly guy. But they definitely looked like they would fit a guy like Jean-Luc, who was much smaller. Later that same day, so this is on February 10th, 2 days after Monique's body was found, Captain Prim was in her office when her phone rang. She answered it, and it was a technician from the crime lab telling her they actually already had the results from the samples that had been sent in for testing. And so Prim, she's geared up, ready to hear some potentially, case-breaking news. But the tech told her that the stains that were on the bike, it was blood, but it was animal blood. He went on to say that the other little droplets of blood that were in Jean-Luc's apartment, like on the walls and near the door handle of the closet, it was blood, but not a match for Monique's. And then also those pants that had been found, that stain on the pants, that wasn't blood at all. That stain was just grease. Prim was very frustrated because in her mind, she had sort of zeroed in on Jean-Luc. It really seemed like he was their guy. But now they really had no physical evidence against him. And as for that bizarre phone call to Christophe's coworker, they really had no way of knowing who those 2 women in the background were, or even if the coworker and his wife had actually overheard the conversation correctly, about the alibi and about Jean-Luc being depressed. Who knows if they actually heard that. So Prim thanked the lab technician for calling with the update, despite how disappointing it was, and she was about to hang up when he told her to wait, because he had one more piece of news for her. He told her that during Monique's autopsy, the medical examiner had actually found DNA under Monique's fingernails, and it was very likely skin cells from her killer that had been scratched off during the struggle. The technician said it would take at least another few weeks to analyze it, but once the results came back, they could definitely test it against DNA samples from any of their suspects, and maybe it would be a match. This definitely gave Prim some hope. And after she hung up, she began making a list of everyone they would need to get a DNA sample from so they could test against it. She definitely knew she would need one from Jean-Luc and Christophe, and then also that neighbor Henri seemed like a strong suspect too. Prem had actually spoken to Henri's wife and confirmed that, at least according to her, they were together that whole night Monique was killed. But she also knew that spouses were very likely to lie for each other, so it was a flimsy alibi. So at this point, Prem felt like she definitely had 3 good potential suspects to get DNA from. But realistically, that was where her list ended. The rest of Monique's family had been ruled out by this point, and none of the other neighbors really seemed like suspects. And by all accounts, Monique lived a pretty quiet suburban life and just didn't really get into trouble with anyone, so there really was no one else. And so to Prem, it just felt like something was missing here. Like, in the time I have between now and when the analysis is done on that DNA underneath Monique's fingernails, I need to see if there's something I've missed. And so over the next few weeks, that's what Prem did. She pored over all the evidence they'd collected, and she re-interviewed all the family members and spoke to all the neighbors. But despite this huge effort, nothing new came up that brought any other suspects into view. However, at the same time, this is early March by this point, maybe 3-4 weeks after the tech had said they would test this DNA, Prem got another call from the crime lab, and the technician said that the DNA analysis had come back. And even before they tested it against any specific suspects, the results were already enough to narrow down the field significantly. And when Prem heard what the tech had to say about the analysis so far, she realized that this was, in fact, the missing piece of information that she needed. Based on this revelatory DNA evidence and also an eventual confession by the killer, this is what police believe happened to Monique Lejeune on the night of February 7th, 2003. The killer walked up to Monique's front door and knocked, and a few seconds later, the door opened and Monique was standing there. But instead of inviting the killer inside, Monique just kind of crossed her arms and stared. At this point, the killer began to speak. However, what was supposed to be a polite conversation quickly escalated into an argument, with both of them hurling insults back and forth. And then at some point, Monique slammed the door in the killer's face. But before she did, she said one last thing that was apparently so inflammatory that it pushed the killer over the edge. And so without even stopping to consider what they were doing, the killer, after having the door slammed in their face and hearing this totally inflammatory line, they stormed over to their vehicle, which was parked nearby, and they grabbed the knife they kept under their seat for self-defense. And they carried that knife right back to the front door and knocked again. And as soon as the door opened, the killer pushed their way inside, and with a surge of rage, they just started stabbing. But Monique was very strong and big, and she knocked the killer to the ground and actually pinned them there. But the killer managed to wrestle their arm free that was holding the knife. But Monique, she kept fighting back. I mean, this was an epic struggle. And also, the whole time this is happening, Monique's 4 dogs have basically come over to the gate, which butted up against the entryway, and they're watching this happen. And they're barking like mad, and Monique is screaming out in rage and panic and pain, until finally they were able to break away from Monique, who kind of had them pinned, despite, getting stabbed repeatedly. And then once the killer was free, they turned and bolted out of the house. The killer ran across the yard, got in their vehicle, began pulling away, and as they did that, they saw Monique stumble out the front door. She took a few steps down the walkway and collapsed to the ground. But the killer didn't wait around to see if she was really dead. Instead, they sped away. And then they stopped at a supermarket parking lot and threw the murder weapon, the knife, in a trash can. And then the killer went home, and they burned their blood-stained clothes in their stove. They thought that would be enough to destroy any evidence linking them to this crime, especially considering the fact that they knew they were like the last person anybody would suspect of such a horrible, violent murder. It would turn out the killer was the 4-foot, 9-inch tall, tiny, frail Beatrice Matisse, Claude's 58-year-old ex-wife. In her confession to police, she claimed she had gone to Monique's house that night to finally, bury the hatchet after years of feuding between the two sides of Claude's family. But she said the bad blood ran way too deep, and when Monique apparently insulted Beatrice's daughters, that was the last inflammatory line as she shut the door, Beatrice said she snapped. Beatrice had actually been ruled out as a suspect primarily because she was really, really small, like too small to have overpowered Monique and then to have potentially moved her body out to the front yard. But it would turn out Monique's body was not moved at all. She stumbled out herself. Monique was apparently so full of adrenaline after getting attacked that she had managed to, chase Beatrice out of the house before she collapsed and died. And keep in mind, she did that after being stabbed over 50 times and losing an immense amount of blood inside. And because Monique had fought back so fiercely, she had managed to get traces of Beatrice's DNA under her fingernails. And so right away, the DNA analysis showed that their killer was a woman. And further testing eventually confirmed that it was a match for Beatrice. Investigators never figured out who made that bizarre phone call to Christoph's coworker, but their best guess was that the women that were heard on the phone call were Christoph's mother and sister. And it was just an innocent conversation about Monique's murder that the coworker misinterpreted. Beatrice Matisse was arrested on March 29, 2003, and she confessed to the murder immediately, although she later recanted the confession. She was eventually found guilty and sentenced to 15 years in jail. On the evening of May 25, 2023, a student named Jung Yoo-jung sat at her desk in her bedroom inside the house where she lived with her grandfather in Busan, which is the second largest city in South Korea. Jung was hunched over with her head in a book, studying for a really important test that she had coming up. But the words on the page just kind of jumbled together and she couldn't focus. And, Jung just felt really frustrated because she knew she needed to consume this material and internalize it. But the way she was doing it clearly wasn't working. She really needed help. However, Jung had previously tried to find a tutor, to get help. But finding the right tutor had proven to be very challenging. So Jung had recently signed up for this mobile app that was supposed to connect high school students to tutors. And she had reached out to over 50 people, asking them if they could help her prepare for this really major exam in her 9th grade English class. But everyone she had spoken to either was not available or just wasn't a good fit. But on this night, as Jung stared down at her book, desperately trying to parse through the words on the page, she suddenly heard her phone buzz. And so Jung, who was sort of eager for a distraction here, she grabbed her phone and she saw there was a notification from that mobile app, the tutoring app. So Jung, she opened up the app and she read the message and she broke into a smile because the reply was from a potential tutor that she'd contacted earlier that day that she had been, sort of optimistic about. According to this tutor's profile, her name was Chae-eun. She was a 26-year-old college student and she spoke fluent English. And now, in her reply, Chae-eun told Jung that she would be more than happy to help her and was actually available to start as soon as the day after tomorrow. There was just one downside. Chae-eun tutored exclusively out of her own apartment, which was on the far north side of the city. So it would be pretty inconvenient for Jung to just get there. And then also she knew her grandfather would definitely worry about her traveling that far alone. But after having searched for a tutor for so long with no success, Jung just did not want to pass up this opportunity. So she immediately messaged back that she couldn't wait to get started. And then she and Chae-eun set up their first meeting. 2 days later, on the evening of May 27th, Jung walked up to the tutor's apartment complex. It had taken her almost an hour to get here on the bus. And she'd been lugging, this huge bag with her full of her study materials the whole time. She had brought along basically all of her stuff, just in case they actually got to studying today, which realistically Jung didn't know if they would. This is their first meeting. She didn't really know what to expect. But either way, Jung was glad to be here. This represented progress. So Jung, along with her big old bag, went up to the door with the apartment number that Chae-eun had given her, and she knocked. A few seconds later, the door swung open, and Jung saw Chae-eun standing there with a big smile on her face, and she looked exactly like she did in her profile picture on the app. Chae-eun then introduced herself and shook Jung's hand and welcomed her inside. Jung walked in and had a quick look around, and she saw the apartment was pretty small. It was a studio apartment. There was a bed and a couch in the same main area, and there was a kitchen and bathroom sort of branching off from there. Just then, Jung heard Chae-eun shut the door, and then she walked right past Jung and she took a seat on the couch, and then she sort of beckoned Jung to come have a seat next to her and come chat. And so Jung, she smiled and she's got her bag and she walks over and she sits down next to Chae-eun, and the pair just start chatting. And, Cheon asks her to explain again, sort of like, what are your main goals here? What can I help you with? And Jung said, well, I have this big test coming up for my English class, and, I was hoping you could help me with that. And Cheon said, yeah, of course I can. I'm fluent in English. I've worked with many people on, similar testing material. So, this is going to be great. And so Jung, she's thrilled, and she says to her tutor, well, like, hey, I brought my stuff. Can we just start the lesson right now? And Cheon was sort of maybe taken a little bit aback. This is their first interaction. But she's like, okay, yeah, let me just get a drink of water first. And so Cheon, she wanders off into the kitchen and disappears to get her water. And Jung unzips her bag and begins fishing out her studying materials. A few hours later, a taxi driver was driving through the northern part of Busan, scanning the sidewalk for potential customers. And at some point, as he looked around, he eventually saw this woman, who appeared to be maybe in her 20s, standing outside of an apartment complex, Cheon's apartment complex. And this woman, she had this large, very heavy-looking black suitcase by her side, and she was waving to the cab driver, clearly trying to hail him down. So the driver pulled up alongside the curb, he rolled down his window, and he called out to her and asked where she needed to go. And the woman told him that she needed to go to the Nakdong River. And this immediately struck the driver as being a little weird, because the Nakdong River was in a very isolated area far outside the city. It was like a really odd place for a young woman to go alone, especially this late at night. But the driver also knew that he could charge the woman a pretty high fare for taking her all that way. So he said, okay. Then he popped the trunk of his cab and asked if she needed help with her suitcase. But she immediately said no, she had it. So the driver just shrugged, and he waited while this woman lugged this heavy suitcase to the back of his cab, and she hoisted it into the trunk, she shut the trunk, and then she climbed inside. And then the driver pulled away from the curb and started heading out of the city. And it was a long, quiet ride, but eventually he pulled up to the entry point for Nakdong River, which was basically a trailhead surrounded by bushes that led into this sort of semi-forested area. At this point, the driver parked, and the woman asked him how much she owed him, and he told her, and so she pulled out her money and she quickly paid him. And then, just out of habit, the driver asked the woman again if she needed help getting her suitcase out of the cab. But again, the woman very quickly said no, she didn't. She would handle it on her own, but thank you. So again, the driver just shrugged and popped the trunk. And then he waited as this woman got out and pulled the suitcase out of the back. Now, at this point, the driver knew, his job is done here. It's not his business what she's doing here. But, it's almost midnight, and he couldn't help but feel sort of concerned about dropping this woman off here, basically in the middle of nowhere so late at night. And he just wanted to make sure that she was okay. So instead of just driving away, he just continued to watch as she walked towards the trailhead. And as he watched her, he noticed that she was really struggling to move her suitcase. I mean, it looked like it was so heavy that she could barely drag it through the dirt. And it was at this point that the driver couldn't help but feel like something's off here. This is not typical behavior. Everything about this just feels weird. What's going on? So, because he had this sort of gut feeling that something was off with this lady, instead of just leaving altogether and continuing his night, he just drove a little ways away from where he dropped her off and then stopped. And he turned and he just watched the trailhead to see if the woman would come back out or if anybody else would show up. And so he just continued to watch and nothing happened for a while. But after about 20 minutes, he saw some movement, and out of the woods comes this woman. And she still has this suitcase, but now it's plainly obvious that the suitcase is empty, or whatever was really heavy inside of the suitcase has been removed, because she's moving the suitcase no problem, whereas before, she could barely get it through the dirt. And the driver, he couldn't help but think, what was in that suitcase? Because clearly, she has come here to dump it somewhere out in this very isolated part of this area. This just feels really bad. I don't even want to know what she's doing. Somebody needs to investigate this, though. This just feels wrong. And so he turned around, he started driving away, he pulled out his phone, and he called the police. A few minutes later, the woman with the suitcase stood at the trailhead, hoping that another taxi might pass by soon and she could hitch a ride home. And at some point, she saw headlights approaching in the darkness, and for a second, she felt really hopeful, and she waved her hand hey, I need a ride. But when the vehicle finally pulled up, she saw that it was not a taxi, it was a police cruiser. And this cruiser came to a stop right next to her, and then an officer stepped out of the car, and asked her what she was doing out here so late. And in a very calm voice, the young woman just said she had come out here to drop off some trash because the dumpster at her apartment complex was full. But the officer didn't really seem to be listening to her. He was actually just staring at her big black suitcase. And he actually just asked her, "Can I see what's inside of that?" And this made the woman very nervous. But she also knew that the best thing she could do right now was just continue to stay calm and cooperate. So she nodded and said, "Sure, have a look." And so the officer walked up and he unzipped the suitcase and he flipped it open and he shined his flashlight inside. And it was empty, but it was covered in blood. Like the blood had soaked into the lining all across the inside of the suitcase. But the woman knew this was going to happen. I mean, she knew what was in there and she'd prepared for this. She told the officer that she was simply on her period and the blood he was seeing was nothing more than menstrual blood. But the look on the officer's face made it very clear that he did not believe anything she was saying. And at that moment, the woman's world came crashing down because she knew that despite all the months of studying she had done, she had just failed her test. It would turn out that Jung Yu Jung was not a 9th grade student studying for an English exam. She was actually a 23-year-old woman masquerading as a high schooler. And her very important test was one she had actually created for herself. She wanted to see if she could commit the perfect murder. She had spent months obsessively studying true crime books and documentaries, coming up with what she thought was a foolproof murder plan. And so after coming up with this plan, she posed as a 9th grader and hired a private tutor, Chae-eun. But when she went to Chae-eun's apartment, she wasn't carrying books in a backpack. She was carrying a knife inside of a suitcase. After Jung told Chae-eun that she wanted to start her lesson, Chae-eun got up, she went into the kitchen, she got some water, and when she came back, Jung had gotten out her knife, and she proceeded to stab Chae-eun to death. And then after that, she dismembered Chae-eun's body, put the pieces inside of that suitcase, and then Jung attempted to dispose of the body in the woods by the Nakdong River. But her foolproof plan did not work, because she was ultimately arrested before she even made it home that night. Jung Yu Jung was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison. Everyday life is full of moments that you plan for, and also moments that just happen, often when you least expect them. Whether it's part of your normal routine or something unexpected, Amazon is where you go for everyday essentials, making shopping simple and dependable. From running out of household basics to last-minute surprises, Amazon's great deals and low prices on everyday essentials make it easier to handle whatever life throws your way. Everything is in one place, so there's no extra stress or jumping through hoops when time is already tight. Whether it's something you buy regularly or something you suddenly realize you need right now, Amazon makes it easy to find what you're looking for quickly and at a price that feels good. It's straightforward, dependable shopping that makes everyday moments feel more manageable with less stress, fewer steps, and more confidence that your money is well spent. Shop Amazon and save on essentials. Save the everyday. On the evening of January 31st, 2012, a 72-year-old retired high school teacher named Norm Johnson was playing the piano in his home in the tiny town of Madison, South Dakota, when his doorbell rang. And Norm was surprised. I mean, not because, just somebody had shown up at his house. I mean, the reality is getting unannounced visitors was not totally unusual in his household. But tonight in particular, it was odd, because the Madison High School basketball team had a big game that night, and pretty much the whole town was there cheering them on. Like, who isn't at the game ringing my doorbell right now? Who would that be? Now, usually Norm would be at the basketball game too. Not only had he coached several sports at the high school during the years he had taught there, but also he had grown up in Madison and he had gone to the high school and he had played on the football team and been on the track team. And, those had really been, in some ways, some of the best years of his life. And I mean, even now as an adult, he still had such strong feelings and such a strong affinity for Madison High. It was like a home away from home. But despite all that, Norm had chosen not to go to the game tonight because he had just had a long day of meetings for the local boards that he volunteered on, and just in general, he felt like he just needed some time home to relax. And so before he got up, Norm called out to his wife, Barb, who was in their kitchen, and he just asked, like, "Hey, do you have any idea who's at the door right now?" And she yelled back, like, "No, I have no idea." So Norm got up from the piano and went to the door to answer it. When he opened the door, he saw a very unassuming man with gray hair and a beard who was standing out on the doorstep. Norm didn't know who this guy was, which was also just kind of odd, because again, Madison is like a really small town, pretty much everybody knew each other. But before Norm could ask him who he was or what he wanted, this guy asked Norm, "Are you Norm Johnson?" And Norm said, "Yeah." And then, without another word, the man raised a pistol he was holding and he fired. An hour later, Madison Police Sergeant Justin Meyer parked his car outside of a little brown house that was now cordoned off with crime scene tape. Meyer had been totally shocked when the dispatcher had called him to tell him what had happened here, both because there hadn't been a murder in Madison in almost 100 years, and because Sergeant Meyer knew the victim, Norm Johnson. And so now, Meyer walked up to the house and stepped over a huge puddle of blood right inside the front door. And then he found Norm's wife, Barb, sitting on the couch with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. I mean, she looked like she was clearly in shock. Around Barb on the walls were all these old photos of her and Norm. And some of these photos clearly dated back to the 1950s when they had been high school sweethearts. Norm had been the star running back on the football team, and Barb had been a cheerleader. Meyer took a deep breath, and then he walked over and sat down next to Barb, and he asked her what happened. And she just said she didn't know. She didn't understand. She said that Norm had just gone to answer the door, and then seconds later, she heard what sounded like 2 gunshots. And then, as Barb sort of choked back tears, she said that she had run over and she had found Norm lying on the floor with blood pouring out of his face. And through the doorway, she happened to see this gray-haired man that she didn't recognize calmly just walking away down their walkway towards his car, and then he just drove off. And Sergeant Meyer, when he heard this, I mean, he really couldn't believe it. I mean, in many ways, he was just as baffled as Barb was about how in the world something like that could have happened, especially in this town. Like, what Barb was describing sounded like a premeditated hit, like an assassination. But Meyer just couldn't imagine who would want to do that to Norm. Like, Norm was beloved by the whole community, and he had been for decades. And so eventually, Meyer left the house and began to speak to all the neighbors. But, as he discovered, pretty much none of them were home at the time of the shooting because they were all out at that basketball game. And then also Meyer discovered that nobody in the area had security cameras outside their houses. And so nobody had captured any images or video of the crime. Because after all, I mean, Madison was typically a very safe area. And so by the time Meyer went home for the night, he was already starting to worry that he might not be able to solve this. However, the very next morning, Meyer got a call from a tipster. And this tipster said that there actually was one person in the area who definitely had a problem with Norm. That was a 73-year-old man named Carl Erickson. And at first, when Meyer began asking some basic follow-up questions, he just couldn't understand how this Carl guy could even be a suspect. I mean, he lived over an hour away in a different town. He was like a retired insurance officer with no criminal record. Like, how in the world would he be the guy that's, assassinating Norm? That just didn't make any sense. There was no clear connection. And then also there was just the fact that as people, they couldn't have been more different. Like, they definitely would not have overlapped in society. You have Norm, who's like very outgoing and social and beloved, and you have Carl, who's totally a loner, keeps to himself, and for the most part was kind of rude and just people didn't really like him. So like, there's just no reason that these two would come together. But Meyer had very little to go on here, and so he needed to follow up on any lead he really got. So that evening, he brought Carl in for questioning. And very quickly he realized that actually, Norm and Carl do have one thing in common. It would turn out Carl and Norm had gone to the same high school. Carl had grown up in Madison before he moved away. And the past 50 years of both of their lives had largely been defined by who they were as teenagers in high school. But while high school had been Norm's glory days, Carl had a very different experience. He had been an outcast who basically, at best, nobody really paid attention to. And so while Norm is like the star of the football team dating the cheerleader, Carl had actually served as the football team's student manager, who basically ran errands for the coach and assisted from the sidelines. Deep down, Carl was deeply jealous of Norm specifically. I mean, he was popular, he's this jock, he's got all the things that he wanted but really couldn't achieve. And then one fateful day in the locker room after a practice, someone had come up behind Carl and put a jockstrap on his head as a kind of awful prank. And, Carl was not totally sure who did it, but over time, he became convinced it was Norm. Now, over time, the people who were involved in that prank, the football players, they just kind of forgot about it. And in fact, many of them sort of forgot about Carl himself. But Carl never forgot the humiliation. He stewed about it for more than 50 years before his anger finally boiled over and he decided it was time to get his revenge. So, on January 31st, 2012, he drove to Norm's home and he shot him in the face. A few months later, Carl pled guilty to second-degree murder and he was sentenced to life in prison. On the afternoon of August 10, 2011, Detective Inspector John Finch of the London Metropolitan Police walked through the courtyard of the Radisson Edwardian Hotel in London. This was a massive luxury hotel with more than 400 rooms. Finch navigated past the beautiful greenery and the koi ponds and the multiple restaurants until he found the door he was looking for, which was roped off by crime scene tape with a uniformed officer standing in front of it. Through the doorway, Finch could see there were forensic technicians taking photographs and putting down evidence markers. This was a section of the hotel where members of the staff lived in small apartments, and the police had been called here by hotel management because the bodies of 2 workers had been discovered inside, and a 3rd worker was missing. Finch had already been briefed on the basics. The 2 dead were a woman named Alice Adams, who was 20, and a man named Tibor Vass, who was also age 20. And they both had been at the same party in the apartment they were found in the night before. Tibor actually lived in this apartment, and it was actually his roommate, a 31-year-old man named Attila Ban, who was the missing 3rd worker. And this was basically all the police knew at this point. They didn't even have a theory yet on whether the missing Attila was another victim or the killer. They really just didn't know. And so now Finch greeted the officer who was at the door and introduced himself and showed his credentials, and then he ducked under the crime scene tape. And before long, he found himself standing in this small living room type area where the first victim, Alice, was lying in this massive pool of blood on the carpet. She was wearing a shirt, but no pants, but she did have underwear on, and she had a couch cushion that was placed over her face, and there were stab wounds all over her body. One of the forensics techs warned Finch to be careful where he stepped because there was so much blood all over the floor, they didn't want Finch to step in it. So very carefully, Finch moved around the outside of the room and made his way into the kitchenette, where another forensics tech was picking up items one by one and dusting them for fingerprints and then setting them back down exactly where they were. And among sort of all the items scattered about the kitchenette, Finch noticed there were lots of pill and alcohol bottles. And so now he began to formulate his first theory, that this party they had all been to the night before had gotten way out of hand, and Alice had been attacked in a sudden rage by somebody who very likely knew her. Her missing pants suggested a possible sexual element, and the sheer number of stab wounds on her body and the amount of blood spatter really did suggest the killer was in some sort of a frenzy. The cushion that was found over Alice's face suggested that after the killer had sort of calmed down after the murder, maybe they had felt guilty and couldn't bear to look at what they had done, and so they covered her up. To Finch, this basically felt like a substance-fueled crime of passion. However, when he stepped into the bedroom, the scene inside of there told a totally different story. On the bed was Tibor Vass, the second victim, and he was completely naked, and he had been very carefully posed in this strange position where he was on his back and his knees were bent. It was immediately obvious to Finch that Tibor had not been killed here on this bed. There was only a tiny bit of blood on the sheets, and Tibor's body itself was perfectly clean, like it had been washed, before being arranged on the mattress. And then, when Finch walked over to get a better look at Tibor's body, he saw that the man's injuries were much neater than Alice's. Tibor only had 2 stab wounds, at least that Finch could see, and both of them were directly to his heart. So this was a very efficient murder. And so after a minute or two, Finch sort of backed up and just found himself feeling really confused, because even though he was in one crime scene, there are 2 victims, 1 crime, it almost felt like it was 2 totally different crimes. Like the murder that took place out there with Alice had been messy and very impulsive seeming, and possibly was because the murderer was, heavily intoxicated. And then this murder of Tibor, it seemed like it was committed by somebody who was much more methodical and potentially even sober. And so Finch couldn't help but wonder, how does this missing roommate, Attila Ban, fit into this picture? Because clearly, that's the piece that seems to be missing and likely would sort of answer all of his questions. And so at this point, what Finch decided he would do is he would go track down the other hotel workers who had been at this party the night before, to see if they knew where Attila was, or what happened to Attila, or why any of this happened. They were there, maybe they knew something. And so Finch, he turned around and he left the bedroom, and he very carefully navigated back across the living room, being careful not to step in any blood. And then he left the apartment. And as he did, he sort of noticed something strange. But right now he knew the most important thing was going and speaking to those other workers to see what they knew. And so for now, he sort of forgot this strange element he thinks he's discovered, put it over here, and just said, I'll deal with that later. And off he went to go find the other workers. Over the next few hours, Finch spoke to a whole bunch of hotel workers, and they were able to tell him a lot about Alice, Tibor, and Attila. Basically, they were all good friends, they all worked together, and they were known for being very responsible and very hardworking. Alice apparently had only just begun working at the hotel a few weeks ago, and coworkers said that she and Tibor seemed to have some chemistry, but no one was sure whether their relationship went beyond a platonic friendship, because Alice actually did have a boyfriend. And Tibor's roommate, Attila, the one who was missing, was apparently a hotel manager. And recently he'd been named Employee of the Year, and everybody seemed to really love working with him. Finch also learned more about the party that Tibor and Attila had hosted in their apartment the night before, during which the murders, must have happened. And apparently it was really just a small gathering to celebrate Tibor getting into college, and the only people in attendance were Tibor, Attila, Alice, and then 2 other coworkers. Finch had interviewed those 2 other coworkers, and they would say that, during this party, this gathering, everybody had been drinking really heavily. But they insisted that it was a calm night without any conflicts or fights. And they both said that when they left the party, Alice and Tibor and Attila were all alive, awake, and totally fine. And so this information certainly seemed to suggest that Attila did it. I mean, he was the most obvious one that could have committed these murders. The 3 were left alone, 2 wind up dead, the 3rd is missing, Attila. But Attila, despite the fact he was missing, which did sort of make him very suspicious, beyond that, he was like this unbelievably sweet guy who had no problems with anyone. He was like the Employee of the Year. It just didn't track. Nobody thought Attila could have done this. Nobody. The fact that Alice had a boyfriend, but apparently was, getting close to Tibor and, sort of going beyond being just platonic, that was intriguing to Finch. Coworkers said Alice, flirted with Tibor a lot, and Finch thought it was definitely possible that maybe the boyfriend had come to the apartment and found Alice and Tibor together being sort of inappropriate and killed them out of jealousy. It felt like a very possible theory. However, that would explain why Alice's body was in the state it was in, but that theory would not explain why Tibor's body had been posed in such a bizarre way, or also what happened to Attila, where's Attila? Now, Finch knew that all day his team had been pulling surveillance video from around the hotel. So in the evening, around 7 p.m., he went back to the station to start combing through the footage. He wanted to get his eyes on every single person who entered and left the employee housing area on the night of the killings. The hotel really was covered in cameras, and odds were the killer would be somewhere on those tapes. But later that night, when Finch finally got to the end of all the footage he was given, he was baffled. So the surveillance video didn't actually show the doorway to Tibor and Attila's apartment. It just showed the area around the building that contained the apartment. So Finch could only see who entered and left the building, not the individual apartment. So that was a limitation. But he could see Tibor and Attila and Alice and those other two party guests enter the building before the party, and he could see those same two party guests leave hours later at almost the exact time they had told him they left. There was no sign of Alice's boyfriend at all, which meant he very likely was not the killer. Otherwise, you'd see him somewhere on this tape and he just was not there. And so as disappointing as that was, it, made sense and it at least sort of progressed the case. But Finch is also thinking, like, the thing the footage also doesn't show is what happened to Attila. Where is Attila? On the morning of August 12th, so 2 days after the bodies were found, Detective Finch went back to the apartment, now with his team of detectives. Attila, at this point, was still missing. Nobody knew what happened to him. And that was actually why Finch was back here with his team. He wanted to take a second look around, not just the building and the apartment, but really the whole area. Because they had traced Attila's phone and it was pinging off a cell tower right next to the hotel, as if he was still here. But, keep in mind, by this point, police have searched the whole grounds, including every room, all the closets, all the utility areas. They've looked everywhere on this property and they have not found a trace of him. But Finch thinks, what else can I do but just keep on looking? So now, Finch and his team greeted the officer who was still standing guard by the crime scene door, and the officer let Finch and the other investigators in. And pretty much the second Finch stepped back inside this apartment now for the second time, he knew something was off. Finch had been staring at crime scene photos for the past 2 days obsessively, and as a result, he really had a good feel for how this place had been left. Because remember, when they take photos and when they, dust for prints and all that, they try to leave the scene exactly the way it is because it's all evidence until, the case is solved. But as soon as he walked in, he saw there was a vodka bottle that clearly had been moved. And his first thought is are you kidding me? Is this us? Are one of our techs moving stuff and not putting it back? Are we tampering with our own evidence? Or worse, has somebody somehow broken in here and moved things around, without our own guards knowing about it? What's going on here? And at the same time, Finch is faced with this new reality here. One of the other investigators pointed to the bedroom door, which was closed. And he said that he'd been here when the forensics team had left, and he was positive they had left that door open. And so Finch is totally flabbergasted. He walks over to the door and he turns the doorknob and tries to open it, but clearly there is something blocking the door, somebody put something on the other side of the door to keep it from opening up all the way. And so at this point, Finch and the other guys began basically ramming on this door until finally they were able to push it open just enough that they could look inside. And when they did, they find the missing third person, Attila Ban. He's lying face down on the bed, he was naked, and he was covered in blood. It would turn out the murders did take place during that party. The killer was there with Alice, Tibor, and Attila. And the killer, at some point during this party, after those other two guests had left, they saw Alice and Tibor kissing, and it drove them mad with jealousy. And they grabbed a knife, and for a short period, they went into an absolute frenzy, repeatedly stabbing Alice brutally until she was dead, and then turning their attention and stabbing Tibor twice in the heart. And so they had brutally killed these two in a total fit of rage. But the killer knew there were some loose ends inside of this apartment. And so very carefully, they slinked their way into the bedroom, and with that same knife they had just used to kill those two, they cut open the side of the mattress, and they crawled inside, and they waited. When Detective Finch first left the apartment, that first time he was there, and he's leaving to go speak to the hotel workers, when he opened the apartment door and he began to leave, he stopped because he noticed something weird. He didn't pursue it right then and there because he wanted to prioritize the interviews, but what he noticed was there's so much blood inside of this apartment. It's everywhere. Like the texts are telling me to be careful where I step so I don't track blood around. But he's looking down, like he's just opened the door to the apartment, and there's no blood leaving the apartment. All the blood is contained inside of the apartment. How is that possible? Well, the reason it was possible is because the killer never left the apartment. And so fast forward 2 days to August 12th, the same day that Detective Finch and his team came back to the apartment to do another sweep. So earlier that same day, the killer is still inside the mattress, but they know now they have to deal with Attila. And so very carefully, the killer slides out of the mattress they've masterfully been hiding in for the past 2 days undetected. And for reasons not fully understood, they ended up moving some things in the apartment, like that vodka bottle that was moved. And then also they went back inside the bedroom with Attila and they barricaded the door shut with something heavy. So they're barricaded inside the very room they've been hiding in. And now it's time to deal with Attila. And so the killer gets on the mattress, and they take their own clothes off, and they cut their wrists. Because it turns out the killer was Attila. They are the same person. And Attila was madly in love with his roommate, Tibor. And at that party, when he saw Tibor kissing Alice, he knew that his love was unrequited. And it threw him into a rage, and he stabbed and killed both of them. And then he sort of arranged Tibor, his love, in this sort of strange position, which probably was because he had such strong feelings for him. And then also when he attempted to take his own life 2 days later, when he staged his own death on the bed there, he sort of arranged himself in the same pose. But again, he didn't die. And so after Finch and his detectives broke into the room, they found Attila, they were able to get him to a hospital and treat him, and then once he was stable, he was arrested, found guilty of the murders, and sentenced to 26 years in prison.